From the News Channel 5 Network, this is OpenLine.
Hello everyone, welcome to OpenLine. Talking about one of the big things happening this legislative session, charter schools and education. Happy to have with us Amy Frogge. She is a former Metro Nashville School Board representative, knows all about this topic, and is here in person. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, I want to get into this topic. It's a difficult topic. You obviously have major concerns about charter schools, but I want to just start with your background.
Sure.
How did you get into this? What is your background? What got you interested and concerned about charter schools?
So I got involved in this discussion about 10 years ago as a PTO mom, and I was completely green. I did not understand the debate. I didn't know anything about charter schools at the time. And so I was working at our local neighborhood school trying to improve the school. We actually were able to improve outcomes there and build community support and build some excitement around the school. And so I was encouraged to run for school board, which I ended up running, and thought that I was going to do the same work at a citywide level. I thought I was going to build support around public education and get people involved and sort of bring community into schools. That was my focus. And instead, when I decided to run, I was told that I needed to raise only about $10,000 to $15,000 to run. My opponent raised $125,000, which is a record amount at that time. And I was sort of thrust into this charter school debate, and that was where all the funding was coming from in my race. I ran again in 2016, and that time the charter school interest, they funded my opponent at about over $200,000. And so, my story is not unique because this is happening nationwide as charter schools are moving into school districts. So, long story, we had a controversial charter school that was our very first vote on the school board. It put the school board in conflict with the state, and I suddenly was involved with a lot of legislative work. And so, just through experience, I have, this has become sort of an area of expertise that I was not expecting to develop.
So you were a PTO mom, and that's why you ran.
Yes.
You ran to be on the school board because of your experience as a PTO mom. And then all of a sudden you're up against an opponent that has a ton of money.
Right.
And that money was because of that opponent's support for expanding charter schools.
Yes.
And did you have an opinion at that point? Did you know what charter schools were?
Not really. I had looked at data. Didn't understand all of the education issues because I was coming up as a mother in the system, which actually ended up being very valuable, but I didn't have a lot of policy expertise. So every time an issue came up, I would look it up and research it, and I looked up charter schools, and I found that it's 83%, 87% of them were performing the same or worse than public schools. So I didn't really understand why we were talking about charter schools so much, because they don't outperform the public schools. So I kept trying to divert the conversation, but we kept coming back to charter schools, and that is because there are a lot of out-of-state interests that are focused on Tennessee. The reason they're focused on Tennessee originally was because we won Race to the Top dollars, which netted the state, $500 million, but that money came with strings attached, and one of the strings was that we were to embrace charter schools, and we created the Achievement School District, which is a state-run organization that basically is a vehicle to authorize more charter schools. They're supposed to take over low-performing schools in the state, but that was the focus, and that's where all of the money was coming from, and that's why Tennessee became a target for the charter school movement.
You served on the school board for 2 terms?
I did, for 8 years.
And that was, you were in there during the height of, or I guess the beginning of that argument over charter schools. The school board was bitterly divided, if I remember.
Yes.
And you were in some pretty difficult meetings. And that was one of the major reasons it was so divided, right?
Yes.
That was a major issue of contention. Now you've moved on, you're no longer on the school board.
Right.
But your concerns about charters remain.
Right.
And what's happened since?
Well, the battle, so the charter schools have pretty much just come into Memphis and Nashville. There are, a handful and the other 2 major cities in the state. But we're saturated in Nashville and Memphis and have had a lot of fights over charter schools in these two areas. And for a variety of reasons, there has been enough pushback, I think, in our two cities. The battle has now moved up to the state. And when charter schools come in, and this is a playbook that's happening nationwide. It's not just happening in Tennessee. There are a series of laws that are passed, and the goal for the laws really is to remove public oversight of public spending and redirect it to private interest. So one of the early laws that was passed when I was on the board was the removal of local control. Local school districts no longer get to have full control of which charter schools are authorized in their districts. They still have to pay for them, but now there is a state commission that is appointed by the governor that can overrule local school boards and force charter schools into districts.
And I want to get into all that, but now I want to even take another step back.
Okay.
Let's go back to when you were the PTO mom and you really didn't even know what charter schools were. How would you define charter schools? If there are people out there who's like, I hear about it all the time. What exactly, how do you define a charter school?
Okay, a charter school is a privately operated, publicly funded school. And they like to say that they're just public schools, but there are a lot of key differences between traditional public schools and charter schools. So charter schools are overseen by a private board. Sometimes they have private management companies that manage their operations. They oftentimes will receive extra funding from investors. Charter schools are big money makers, and that's what's really driving the movement and why we're seeing so much money coming into our legislature and local districts and the school board races. And again, in other cities, there are school board candidates that are up against literally millions of dollars they're coming in school board races. But they just have some advantages that traditional public schools do not.
How do charter schools make their money?
Okay, there are a variety of ways. Probably the biggest way they make money, and this is what they're most interested in, and there's a bill pending on this issue, is they come in and they buy a property. They use taxpayer dollars to pay off that investment. And then at the end of the day, the property belongs to the charter school investor and not the public. So, you know, when we're building a local high school in Bellevue, that's taxpayer dollars pay for that, but that money remains within the community. There are tax incentives. They make money through EMOs, which are charter management companies. They can hand over the operations to a charter management company. Let me see, I wrote down a few notes. The board members, the private board members that might be running them can sell supplies to students or uniforms, that kind of thing. But all of this, I think it's removing the tax dollars from the community and the taxpayers that fund the operations.
Because when a student decides to go to a charter school, the money that the state is giving for that student follows the student, right? I mean, the charter school gets that money. Is that right?
Right, they do. Well, so there are two problems. Let me go back also and just say that there's a lot of conversation that charter schools are nonprofit entities. There is huge profit in charter schools, whether or not they label themselves nonprofits, and they also will have these supposedly nonprofit charter school management companies that are also finding ways to make profit. The problem with all of this, and you get questions about, does it, so we have a lot of situations where, you have profit and maybe you still have good outcomes. But in education, it really perverts the aim of education. And you create these perverse incentives around test scores, and it minimizes enrichment for students. They end up losing the arts or sports or that kind of thing because charter schools drain funds from the public school system. So
when a child leaves and goes to a charter school, that's money that's taken out of public schools, taken away from public schools.
And here's the difference. So there are basically two ways that charter schools have a negative impact on public school systems. Okay, first of all, they do drain money from the system. The reason they drain money is because under state law and our charter school contracts, charter schools are always paid, and they're always paid first. So that means if there is a funding deficit, the burden of that deficit falls only on the neighborhood school. And as the charter students leave the district, there's no way to offset the loss of funds because the charter students are coming from schools throughout the district. So say if you've got 5 charter school students leaving, they're not going to come from the same classroom. So you can't cut the teacher there, or you can't cut the utilities. We have to continue operating the public school system, but now we're also funding a separate charter system, which has all of the fiscal advantages. And then the second way charter schools have a negative impact on public school systems is they cherry pick students. They're not supposed to do that, but they do. There are a lot of different ways that they will sculpt a student population. So charter schools are incentivized by standardized test scores, and they have to get those to stay afloat and to market themselves to prospective families. So they are looking for the least costly to educate and the least challenging to educate students. And so as charter schools remove both funding from public schools and the least costly and challenging to educate children and often the better resource families from the public system, you are left with a public school system that is then serving increasing numbers of high-need students with diminishing resources, and that's a recipe for failure.
You're saying charter schools could kick out kids that
they do
that bring down test scores or that they
right.
that are more costly to educate. Is that right?
Right. So in Nashville, we looked at the types of students that charters are serving, and they tend to serve less English learner students, which obviously need real resources to succeed. They tend to serve less special needs students, and particularly severe special needs students. There are ways that they can incentivize certain families to apply at certain times. That might make the application process more difficult, or they have a limited time period within which to apply or a certain place to apply, that kind of thing. They may require parents to provide transportation, and that's a different population sometimes. And then they do counsel out students. I got a lot of calls from parents and teachers complaining at test time in the spring. There's always a lot of low-performing charter students coming out of charter schools back into the neighborhood schools, right before the state tests.
So the other side would say, all right, we got to try something. Public schools have been struggling. You look at certain public schools, and their test scores are not good, and we've got to do something. And this is. It sounds appealing. There's this private sector that's going to come in, and we're going to use private sector ideals and measurements, and we're going to turn this around. Mm-hmm. And so when you hear that, that's what they say. What do you say to that?
Well, I'd say first of all, it hasn't worked. There's no evidence that any of this works, and I'll give you some numbers. So the idea behind charter schools, well, first of all, they were started as sort of these lab schools that were supposed to be creative and innovative and try out different new methods on different populations. That is not what they've become, largely because corporate interests have become interested in them. And again, we've created a lot of perverse incentives around the charter schools, which are not about educating students. But when we look at the performance of charter schools in Tennessee, and again, remember, the idea was they're going to come in, have higher test scores, create competition. The competition is going to make all the public schools better. What's really happened is, according to the state report card, they have this success rate, which they define as students who are on track or mastered on state tests. So over a decade after charter schools started coming into our school systems, 37% of Tennessee charter schools have a success rate of 5% or less. It's almost 40% have 5% or less. 77% have a success rate less than 10%. In Nashville, we have 7 charter schools performing above the district average and 19 below. And then the Achievement School District, which is state-run, has an average success rate of 4.5%. So we're not improving outcomes, through the charter schools, and also the charter schools are having a negative fiscal impact on local districts. And we had 2 independent studies in Nashville that confirmed that they do indeed have a negative fiscal impact on school districts.
So that's kind of big picture about your concern. So
yeah.
Your concern. Now,
right.
What are you seeing this legislative session? And we're going to talk a lot about that, but just before we go to break, set the table for what are your concerns about this legislative session?
So what we see happening in Tennessee, again, this is a national privatization playbook. And the playbook goes like this. You starve schools of funding, you label them, quote, failing, and then you bring in, solutions, and solutions are always money makers for someone, and so their charter schools or vouchers or more standardized testing. We are seeing a glut of bad bills that are intended, again, to remove local control from elected officials, that are removing regulations on charter schools. And I'll be happy to tell you about what happens when you don't have regulations, because there are a lot of charter school scandals in Tennessee. And it really is just, there's an immense focus, a lot of energy being placed behind a lot of bad bills this session. It's the worst I've seen it in 10 years. So. And
there's the new funding formula, right?
Yes, there's a new funding formula.
which will lead to more money for education, but there are concerns. You have concerns about what that means as far as charter funding. Well,
it's charter funding, and also it's not really more funding. It sounds good, but it's not what it's presented to be.
Okay, so that sets the table. All right, well, good. Well,
okay.
It's such a big topic.
It is.
All right, that sets the table for our discussion. There is the number if you want to call in: 615-737-PLUS. 615-737-7587. We'll take a break. Be back right after this.